Welcome to Chronicle Stories TV. Before we begin, please drop a like or subscribe. The last of the autumn sun poured through Jake's living room window, casting orange streaks across the hardwood floor. Outside, leaves rustled in the wind, scraping against the siding of his old family home. It had been his grandparents' place once, creaky, drafty, and full of forgotten corners. But Jake liked it that way. He liked how the silence seemed to breathe in this house. On that Friday evening, he was expecting his two closest friends, Ricky and John, for a night of pizza, horror movies, and laughter. What he wasn't expecting was the board. "Check this out," Ricky said, holding up a wooden box with faded engravings when he walked through the door. "Got it from an antique store in town. Guy sold it to me for $10. Said it was cursed." Jake gave him a look. "You're such an idiot." "I'm serious," Ricky said with a grin. "Said it was found in the walls of an abandoned house outside of Woodstock. Look." He opened the box, revealing the Ouija board inside, dark wood, etched letters, and a small planchette that looked hand-carved. John, tall and quiet, stepped inside behind Ricky, his hands shoved deep into his hoodie pockets. "We really doing this?" "It's just a game," Jake said, though his tone carried some hesitation. "Nothing's going to happen." They set it on the kitchen table, still sticky from pizza grease, and turned off the overhead lights. Jake lit a few candles from the cupboard, the only kind his mom left behind, lavender-scented and a bit cheesy, but they do. The room dimmed. Shadows stretched against the walls. The air felt just a little colder. Jake sat across from Ricky. John took the side facing the window. "So," Ricky said, placing his fingers on the planchette, "let's talk to some ghosts." Jake hesitated before placing his fingertips on the planchette. The wood was cool, smooth, like it had been handled 1,000 times before. John reluctantly followed, sighing under his breath as he slid his fingers into place. Outside, the wind picked up. Tree branches scraped softly against the windows. "All right," Ricky began with a mocking tone, "is there anyone here who wishes to speak with us?" They waited. Nothing happened. "Guess the ghost is shy," Ricky chuckled. "Don't make fun of it," John muttered. Jake kept his eyes on the planchette. The candle flames flickered ever so slightly, like the air was shifting. Then, almost imperceptibly, the planchette moved. Just a tiny nudge. Jake pulled back slightly. "Did you just move that?" he asked Ricky. "Nope. I didn't do it either," John said, eyes narrowing. The planchette slid again, this time slowly but with purpose. It stopped at yes. Jake swallowed. The house was suddenly quiet. Too quiet. Even the wind had stilled outside. Ricky forced a laugh, trying to ease the tension. "Okay, very funny, ghost. What's your name?" The planchette jerked this time, faster. Their fingers stayed light, yet it moved with eerie control. "Alice." Jake's mouth went dry. "Alice. Are you alone?" John asked, his voice low. The board paused. The planchette hovered for a second, then dragged itself to NO. Silence. Jake looked around the room, his ears straining. He could swear he heard something. A whisper. But it wasn't clear. Just a sound, like breath. "What do you want?" Ricky asked, his voice cracking slightly. The planchette began to move again, slowly spelling. TOBESEEN. Jake's eyes darted toward the hallway behind John. There was something off. The darkness at the edge of the doorway seemed deeper, like it folded inward. "I'm done," Jake said, pulling his fingers back. The board stopped moving. "Come on, man," Ricky said. "We were just getting somewhere." But Jake stood up. "This doesn't feel right." John nodded. "He's right. Let's put it away." Ricky sighed, but he agreed. They packed the board back into its box and shoved it under the couch. They turned the lights back on and tried to laugh it off. But something had changed. Jake could feel it. The house didn't feel like his anymore. It felt like it was watching. That night, after Ricky and John left, Jake stood at the front door longer than usual, staring into the dark street. The leaves rustled gently on the sidewalk. Everything looked normal, but it didn't feel normal. There was a heaviness in the air, like the house was holding its breath. He locked the door and turned off the lights, then went upstairs to his bedroom. The house creaked like it always did, but every groan now sounded deliberate. Intentional. Jake lay in bed with the covers pulled up to his chest, scrolling through his phone to distract himself. Every so often, he'd glance at the doorway, half expecting someone to be standing there. But it was always empty. At 3:13 a.m., he woke up suddenly. No dream. No noise. Just awake. The room was cold. Too cold. His breath came out in a soft fog. Jake sat up slowly, confused. The heat should have kicked in hours ago. He reached over and flicked on the lamp beside his bed. Nothing. He tapped it again. Still nothing. Then, he heard it. A whisper. So soft, he wasn't sure it was real. It seemed to come from the hallway, like a voice just beyond the door, murmuring words he couldn't understand. Jake's chest tightened. He stood and crept toward the door, heart thudding hard in his ribs. As he opened it slowly, the whispering stopped. The hallway was pitch black. He reached for the wall switch. Click. Still nothing. The power was out, he told himself. Probably just the power. But when he turned to go back inside his room, his eyes caught movement, just at the edge of the stairs. Something pale. A glimpse of a figure. He froze. It was a girl. Standing at the bottom of the stairs. Thin. Barefoot. Wearing what looked like a hospital gown, soaked through with something dark. Her head hung low, hair draped over her face. Slowly, she raised an arm and pointed toward the kitchen. Jake didn't move. Then, in the blink of an eye, she was gone. Vanished. As if she had never been there. Jake slammed his door shut and locked it. He slid a chair under the doorknob and backed away, shaking. He didn't sleep for the rest of the night. In the morning, the power was back on. The house looked normal again. But the planchette from the Ouija board was no longer under the couch. It was sitting on the kitchen table. Jake stared at the planchette sitting on the table. He hadn't moved it. No one else had been in the house. He stood there for a long time, just staring, as the morning sun slowly crept across the floor. His body was tense, his mind racing through every possible explanation. Maybe Ricky was messing with him. Maybe he came back in during the night. But the doors were locked. The windows too. There hadn't been a single sound. Jake cautiously approached the table and picked up the planchette. It felt colder than before. Unnaturally cold. Like it had been resting in a freezer. He decided to call Ricky. "Yo," Ricky answered groggily. "You good? Did you come back here last night?" Jake asked quietly. "What?" "No." "Why?" Jake glanced at the table again. The board. The planchette. It was out. Like someone used it. Silence. Then Ricky chuckled nervously. "Nah, man. You're just psyching yourself out. That board's probably just messing with your head." "I saw something," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "At the bottom of the stairs. A girl." She pointed at the kitchen. Then disappeared. The line stayed quiet for a moment. Then Ricky said, "I didn't want to say anything, but something weird happened to me last night too." Jake froze. "What?" "I was in bed, just about to pass out. I turned off the light, and right as I started to doze off, I heard breathing. Like, next to my bed. I turned the light on, and there was this guy. Standing in the corner. He didn't have a mouth." Jake's stomach dropped. What do you mean, no mouth? Like it was sealed shut. Skin. No lips. Just smooth. He stared at me for maybe 5 seconds and then he was gone. Jake felt sick. We let something in, Rick. This isn't a game. Later that afternoon, John texted both of them. Bro, did you guys feel weird after last night? I woke up with 3 scratches on my back. I didn't hit anything. They're deep. Like claws. Jake didn't reply right away. Instead, he sat at the table, alone in the house, staring at the Ouija board. He couldn't shake the cold, the dread in his chest. And then he noticed something else. The dust around the board had been disturbed, moved in strange patterns. Symbols. Circles. And just below the board, written faintly on the wood of the table, was a message. You let us in. Jake backed away from the table slowly, his eyes fixed on the words etched into the wood, you let us in. They hadn't been there the night before, he was certain. His stomach turned. He reached out and touched the message with trembling fingers. It wasn't written in marker or scratched in. It was burned into the wood. The grooves were warm. The air around him felt different now. Still. Dense. Like the walls were listening. His phone buzzed again. A message from John. I heard something whispering my name last night. It said, come downstairs. But I was alone. What's happening? Jake didn't answer. Instead, he went upstairs, grabbed the box that the Ouija board came in, and shoved everything back inside, board, planchette, even the candles they'd used. He taped the box shut and stuffed it into a closet at the very back of the house, beneath piles of blankets and old coats. But the sense of wrongness didn't go away. That night, Jake stayed awake in bed, his bedroom door firmly shut, his lamp left on. He wore headphones, trying to drown out the silence with music, but the unease kept building. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was in the room with him. Watching. Waiting. At 3:13 a.m., again, he heard it. Tap. 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 He pulled off the headphones. The sound was coming from the window. He turned slowly, dread crawling up his spine. At first, it looked like condensation. But then he saw it, a handprint. Small, child-sized, pressed against the glass from the outside. Jake lived on the second floor. Then, tap tap tap, another handprint, right beside it. And then another. And another. Until the window was covered in pale, wet prints. Jake scrambled out of bed and ran to the hallway. The lights flickered as he passed under them. The air was ice cold again. But what made him freeze was the sound coming from the kitchen below. Footsteps. Slow, dragging footsteps on the floorboards. Not fast. Not trying to hide. Whoever, or whatever, was downstairs wanted to be heard. Jake crept to the top of the staircase and peered down. There, in the dim light of the hallway night bulb, were shadows moving. More than one. They didn't walk like people. They glided, their forms flickering like flame. He could count 3, no, 4 shapes, shifting between the walls and furniture like fog with eyes. And then, one of them turned its head. A woman with her mouth hanging open, jaw unhinged, eyes wide and glassy. She saw him. She started crawling, fast, up the stairs. Jake slammed his door shut, locked it, shoved his dresser in front of it, and curled into the corner of the room, whispering to himself over and over. This isn't real, this isn't real. But it was. And he knew it. Jake didn't sleep that night. He sat with his back against the far wall of his bedroom, knees pulled to his chest, a kitchen knife in one trembling hand. The whispers never stopped. Sometimes they came from the hallway. Faint, almost thoughtful. Sometimes from right behind the door, just inches away. A woman's voice, humming. But the worst was when he heard scratching. Soft at first. Then harder. Like fingernails or claws, dragging across the wood just outside his room. Around 5 a.m., the house went silent again. No scratching. No whispers. Just the familiar creaks of a home settling in the cold. Jake waited until the sun rose. Only then did he move the dresser away from the door. He opened it slowly, heart pounding. Nothing. The hallway was empty. The handprints on the window were gone. Even the board, sealed away in the closet, felt like a distant memory now. But he knew it wasn't over. By the time Ricky and John arrived later that day, Jake looked like he hadn't slept in years. "You look like hell, man," Ricky said as they stepped inside. Jake didn't respond. He just walked them to the kitchen and pointed at the message still burned into the table. John stared at it. "You didn't do this." Jake shook his head. It wasn't there yesterday morning. And last night, they came back. Not just one. All of them. Ricky pulled out his phone and opened his camera. "We need to record this. All of it. We need to undo it," Jake said. "There has to be a way." John, quieter than usual, looked around the room. "Maybe it's not the board. Maybe it's us. We touched it. We asked questions. We gave them permission." Jake's voice was hollow. "Then how do we take it back?" Silence. Later that evening, they gathered in the basement, somewhere they hadn't been in weeks. Jake had dug out the board again, despite every instinct screaming at him not to. "This is the only way," he muttered. "We ask how to close it." The candles were lit. The board was placed in the center. They sat in a triangle, once again resting their fingertips on the planchette. "Is anyone here?" Jake asked. Immediately, the planchette shot to yes. It moved like it was waiting, impatient. Ricky swallowed. "How do we make you leave?" The planchette didn't hesitate. "Youcant." John flinched. "Ask it why." Jake's throat was dry. "Why not?" The board answered slowly, dragging itself across each letter with purpose. "Youarettheirhome." Jake's heart sank. "They're attached to us." Suddenly, every candle in the room went out, all at once. The basement was plunged into pitch black. Then, they heard it. A soft breath, right behind Jake's ear. Jake didn't move. None of them did. They sat frozen in the darkness of the basement, their breath shallow, their minds grasping for reason. The air was thick, humid, almost suffocating. The silence had a presence, like something was crouching in the center of the room, just inches away from their faces, waiting to be acknowledged. Jake slowly reached for his phone, the light from the screen spilling across the board. No one was there. But the board had changed. The planchette now rested on a single word. "Stay." Jake's hand trembled. "We shouldn't have touched it. We should have never opened it again. We should leave," John whispered. "Right now. Leave the house. Stay with someone. Just go." But Ricky shook his head. "It won't help. You saw what it said, we're not haunted. We're the haunting." The three of them sat in silence, lit only by Jake's flickering phone screen. Then Jake noticed something else. A small, pale handprint, just one, stamped in dust on the floor beside the board. It hadn't been there before. Jake pointed, and all three stared at it, wide-eyed. It looked like it had crawled up from under the floorboards. Beneath them. "Guys," Ricky said, voice cracking, "what if they're not around us? What if they're below us?" Jake slowly stood, stepping back from the board, his shoe creaking on the old wooden planks. The handprint vanished as he moved, just faded like smoke. He tapped the floor with his heel. It sounded hollow. John found a crowbar in the corner of the basement. "Don't," Jake said immediately. "Don't open it." But John was already working on the edge of a warped plank, sweat dripping down his face. It popped free with a dry snap. The smell hit them first. Rot. Earth. And something worse, something sour, metallic, like old blood soaked into soil. John shined his flashlight into the dark crawlspace beneath the floor. At first, it looked empty. Then Jake saw the carvings. Symbols. Circles. Triangles. Strange letters etched into the dirt and beams. And bones. Small bones. "What is this?" Ricky whispered. Jake didn't answer. Because he saw something move. In the back corner of the crawlspace, two pale eyes blinked open, reflecting the flashlight like a cat's. But they were too human. Too knowing. And then another pair opened beside them. And another. 4. 5. 6. The eyes stared up at them, unblinking. Then, in perfect unison, a chorus of low, breathy voices rose from the earth. "You can't leave us now." Jake stumbled backward, nearly falling as his foot caught on a candle. The beam of John's flashlight flickered wildly, casting fast-moving shadows across the walls. The crawlspace beneath them groaned. Not from the house shifting, but from movement. Dozens of eyes still stared upward, glowing faintly like animals trapped in headlights. They didn't blink. They didn't breathe. Then, a hand emerged from the dirt. Thin. Pale. Covered in what looked like dried mud and blood. Its fingers twitched as they gripped the floorboard's edge. Another hand followed. Then a face. A girl, maybe 9 or 10, with wet hair clinging to her skull and eyes that seemed far too wide. Jake froze. She smiled. Not a kind smile. The girl dragged herself halfway up through the gap, shoulders jerking unnaturally, elbows bending the wrong way, like she was unfolding from the dirt. A sharp, dry pop echoed as her neck turned toward him. "Jake," she whispered. He hadn't told her his name. Ricky screamed and kicked the board across the room. The moment it left the circle of candle wax, the air shifted, like something in the house suddenly awoke. The lights upstairs flickered on and off in rapid bursts. Cabinets slammed. Glass shattered. The girl below let out a sound that wasn't a voice, more like a long, scraping inhale. Then she dropped back into the crawlspace, vanishing into the dark. Silence. They all stood motionless, eyes fixed on the now empty hole in the floor. The air smelled of rot and electricity, sharp and nauseating. "We need to go," Jake said, his voice low and hoarse. "Now." They didn't speak as they ran upstairs, out the front door, and into the cold autumn air. The wind howled, bending tree limbs low like they were reaching out to catch them. Leaves swirled violently around their feet. They drove to Ricky's house in silence. No music. No conversation. Just the humming of the tires and the feeling that something invisible was pressing against the windows. When they finally arrived, Jake stayed up while the others tried to sleep. At 3:13 a.m., his phone buzzed. Unknown number. One message. "You shouldn't have looked under the floor." His heart pounded. He stared at the screen as the second message arrived. "She's not the only one that remembers you." He turned to the window and saw a single handprint. On the inside of the glass. Jake stood up slowly, staring at the window. The handprint was small, child-sized, but smudged in a strange way, like the fingers had dragged downward as if whoever left it had been pulled away mid-touch. The room was cold again. Not just cold in the sense of temperature, but a deep, unnatural chill that sank into the bones. The air was still, but Jake could feel something moving around him. Not footsteps. Not breathing. Just Prez. House was supposed to be safe. Newer. Livelier. It had warmth and light. But now, it felt hollow. A shell. As if the moment Jake stepped inside, whatever haunted him had followed. His phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. "Your names are known. Your faces are kept." Jake's hands shook. He turned the phone off. From the hallway, he heard a low creaking. He stepped out and saw the attic door at the end of the hall, slowly opening. He stared at it. The string that dangled from the ceiling hatch swayed gently, back and forth. But there was no wind. No vibration. It was just moving. He backed away. From the guest room, Ricky stirred. "What are you doing?" he mumbled, half asleep. "Something's in the attic." Ricky blinked, more awake now. "Are you serious?" Jake just pointed. Ricky stood up and stepped into the hall. The attic door was wide open now. John stepped out behind them, yawning. "Why are we all up?" Jake looked at them both. "They followed us." Ricky ran a hand through his hair. "What do they want? What are we supposed to do?" A new voice answered them. "Stay." It didn't come from any of them. It came from above. All three boys looked up. A face was peering down from the attic opening. Pale, hairless, its eyes glossy and wide. It didn't blink. Didn't breathe. Then it grinned. The boys ran. They didn't grab phones. Or jackets. They didn't lock the door behind them. They just ran into the street, barefoot and shaking. It wasn't until they were halfway down the block that Jake realized something. He could still hear the voice. "Stay. Stay. Stay." Repeating. Inside his head. They reached Jake's car. John climbed in first. Then Ricky. Jake fumbled with the keys, finally getting the engine to start. As they pulled away, Jake looked in the rearview mirror. There, standing at the edge of the driveway, was a crowd. 7 or 8 figures. All watching. All waiting. Not one of them had a face. The car's engine roared as Jake slammed the door shut and floored the gas pedal. The dark figures at the end of the driveway didn't move. They just stood there, like statues carved from shadow, faceless and still. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting eerie streaks of light over the empty road ahead. John glanced nervously in the rearview mirror. "Did you see that? Their faces, they're just blank." Ricky swallowed hard. How can something not have a face? Jake's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "Doesn't matter. We have to get away." The car sped through the quiet neighborhood. Houses passed by like ghost ships in fog. The street was empty, except for one thing. At every corner, at every turn, Jake swore he saw more of those faceless watchers. Standing silently in yards, behind trees, even in the middle of the street. Always watching. The radio crackled suddenly, static at first, then a voice. Whispering, hissing. "You belong to us now." Jake reached to turn it off, but the voice only grew louder. "Stay. Stay. Stay." Ricky gasped. "It's inside the car." "The radio, it's not ours anymore." John reached forward and yanked the volume knob down, but the static remained, relentless. "Where do we go?" John asked, eyes darting between the shadows outside. Jake's mind raced. "I don't know. Anywhere but here." They drove aimlessly, the sun beginning to rise and paint the horizon in muted colors. Yet the weight of unseen eyes never lifted. The faceless watchers faded with the night, but only to reappear in Jake's dreams, always waiting, always watching. And as the morning light touched the windshield, Jake realized a terrifying truth. They weren't just in the house. They were in him. Days passed in a blur. Jake tried to shake the feeling, but no matter where he went, the shadows followed. The whispering voices drifted through the corners of his mind like an unrelenting fog. Sometimes he'd catch glimpses in reflective surfaces. A faceless figure standing behind him in the mirror, or in the glass of a window as he walked outside. Ricky and John tried to help, but the fear was eating them alive too. One afternoon, Jake sat alone in his room, the sun filtering softly through the curtains. He held the Ouija board box tight, his fingers tracing the faded symbols carved into the wood. He wanted answers. Desperation clawed at him. He pulled the board out and set it carefully on the table. "Maybe we can talk to them," he whispered. "Maybe we can ask what they want." The planchette lay still. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then, it began to glide. Slowly. Deliberately. It spelled out. Leave. Jake's heart pounded. Why? He asked aloud, voice shaking. The planchette circled the word. Because. Because what? Jake pressed. Suddenly, the candle flames flickered and went out. The room plunged into darkness. A whisper brushed past his ear. You belong to us. Jake spun around, but no one was there. His breath hitched as the voice echoed inside his head, growing louder. He sank into his chair, eyes wide, trembling. For the first time, Jake felt the true weight of their presence, not just outside, but inside his mind. He realized then, the ghosts weren't just haunting his house. They were haunting him. Days slipped into restless nights. Jake's world narrowed to the walls of his bedroom, where shadows seemed to pulse and writhe just beyond sight. The whispers inside his mind had grown louder, more insistent, more demanding. They told him things no one should hear, secrets of the house, of the spirits trapped beneath the floorboards, and, most terrifyingly, of what was coming. His friends tried to reach him, but Jake was slipping away. His eyes were sunken. His skin pale. Sometimes, mid-conversation, he would freeze, staring past them into a space only he could see. One evening, Ricky burst through the front door, panic in his eyes. Jake! You have to get out of there. Now. Why? What happened? John asked, catching up behind him. Jake's voice was barely a whisper. They're inside me. I can't stop hearing them. I think they're trying to take over. Ricky pulled out his phone. I found something. An old article about the house. It's been abandoned before. They say people who lived here went insane. Disappeared. Or worse. John leaned over to look. The headline read, Local family vanishes after Ouija board ritual goes wrong. Jake swallowed hard. It's not just a story. We have to do something, Ricky said. Find a way to break the connection. But how? Jake asked, desperation cracking his voice. They're everywhere, in my mind, in the house. I don't know how much longer I can hold on. Suddenly, the lights flickered violently. The floor beneath them trembled. A low, guttural sound filled the room. From the corner, a figure stepped forward, a man with hollow eyes and a stitched mouth, his skin stretched tight over his skull. You called us, the figure whispered, voice like dry leaves. Jake felt cold fingers wrap around his heart. The breaking point was near. Jake knew what had to be done. The spirits, these restless, angry souls, had claimed a part of him, and if he didn't act soon, there would be no coming back. Ricky and John stood beside him, their faces pale but determined. We have to reverse it, Jake said, voice firm despite the fear choking him. Whatever this ritual was, we can close the door. Ricky nodded. I found a book in the library archives, old, dusty, filled with spells and protections. It talks about closing gateways. John held up a small vial of salt and a bundle of sage Ricky had bought on a whim. The three of them returned to Jake's house, stepping carefully inside the heavy silence that seemed to press against their skin. The Ouija board sat on the kitchen table, untouched. Jake placed the ancient book on the table and opened it. The pages crackled like dry leaves. Together, they prepared the circle of salt and lit the sage. The smell filled the room, sharp and cleansing. Jake recited the words from the book, ancient phrases in a language he barely understood. The room responded. The air grew thick. The shadows twisted and writhed, voices rising in furious chorus. The faceless man appeared again, hovering near the ceiling. The girl from the crawlspace floated by, her eyes dark pools of anger. But Jake kept reading. His voice grew stronger with each verse. The spirits screamed, a sound that rattled windows and shook the floor. Then, silence. The candles flickered and went out. When the lights returned, the house felt lighter. The heavy weight had lifted. Jake looked at his friends, exhausted but hopeful. "We did it," Ricky whispered. But Jake wasn't so sure. From the corner of his eye, he saw a single shadow flicker, faint but unmistakable. Watching. Waiting. The morning light crept through the curtains, soft and calm. For the first time in days, Jake felt the tension in his chest ease. The house no longer felt suffocating, the whispers faded to silence. Ricky and John were packing up to leave, relief written on their faces. They exchanged tired smiles, knowing they had faced something beyond explanation, and survived. Jake walked into the kitchen, eyeing the Ouija board one last time. The planchette sat still, almost innocent now. He reached out and touched it. Suddenly, a cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing the candles in a rush. A voice, low and gravelly, echoed in the silence. "This is not the end." Jake's fingers trembled as the words burned into his mind. He pulled back his hand, heart pounding. Ricky called from the hallway. "Jake. You coming?" He nodded, swallowing hard. As they stepped outside, the sun bathed the house in warm light, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling of eyes still watching, from inside, and far beyond. He knew the spirits were patient, waiting for the next time someone dared to say their names. Weeks passed. Life tried to push Jake forward, school, friends, the normal noise of the world. But at night, the silence returned. One evening, Jake sat alone in his room, the Ouija board locked away in a box in the closet. He tried to focus on a book, but his thoughts kept drifting. A soft tapping came from the window. He looked up slowly. The same small handprint was there. On the outside. The glass was cold under his fingertips. A whisper floated through the room. "We never left." Jake shivered. The house around him suddenly felt alive again, breathing, watching. He pulled the curtains closed. But the whispers followed. No matter how far he ran, no matter what he tried to forget, they were waiting. Watching. Always. Days stretched into restless nights. Jake tried everything. He burned sage, played music loud, even slept with the lights on. But the house was never silent. The whispering voices crept into every corner of his mind, feeding on his fear. One evening, while scrolling on his phone, Jake paused when a new message popped up. No number, just text. "You can't hide." His breath caught in his throat. The room suddenly dropped in temperature. He wrapped his arms around himself, feeling watched. The shadows lengthened and shifted unnaturally. Suddenly, the bedroom door creaked open. No one was there. Jake's eyes darted to the corner where a faint silhouette lingered, a woman with hollow eyes, face pale and expressionless. She slowly raised a finger, pointing directly at him. The room filled with the low hum of distant voices chanting. Jake's heart raced. He realized then, the ghosts were not just trapped in the house. They were trapped in him. Jake's life unraveled in the weeks that followed. Sleep became impossible. Every mirror, every reflective surface showed fleeting glimpses of the faceless figures lurking just behind him. His friends tried to reach out, but the distance grew. One night, alone in his room, Jake heard footsteps, soft, deliberate, pacing just beyond the wall. The whispering voices crescendoed into a deafening roar. He clutched his head, knees shaking. "Leave," they hissed, over and over. But Jake was trapped. Suddenly, the door slammed open, and cold air rushed in. A shadowy figure stood there, a tall man with no mouth, eyes like black pits. Jake froze. The figure reached out, and Jake felt an icy grip around his throat. "Stay with us," the voice echoed inside his mind. Jake's vision blurred. His last thought was a desperate prayer to be free. Jake woke with a start, drenched in sweat, the oppressive weight of the night still clinging to his chest. The room was pitch black, yet he could feel the presence, heavy and suffocating. He tried to rise, but his body refused. Invisible hands gripped his limbs, holding him down. Whispers slithered through the darkness, repeating one word over and over. Belong. His mind spiraled, memories of the Ouija board, the crawlspace, the faceless watchers flooding back with crushing clarity. In his heart, Jake knew there was no escape. The house had claimed him. The ghosts were inside now. And they would never let go. Days blurred into nights, and Jake's grip on reality slipped further away. His friends barely recognized the hollow shell he'd become. Yet, deep inside, a small spark of hope remained. One evening, as a storm raged outside, Jake found a note tucked under his bedroom door. The handwriting was shaky, unfamiliar. You must leave before the next full moon, or be ours forever. A chill ran down his spine. The full moon was just 3 nights away. Determined, Jake called Ricky and John. We're ending this. Tonight. They gathered at the house once more, armed with salt, sage, and the ancient book. But as the clock struck midnight, the house seemed alive. Breathing, watching, waiting. The shadows coalesced into terrifying shapes, their whispers growing louder. Stay, they hissed. Jake swallowed his fear. Not this time. The 3 friends gathered in the dimly lit living room, salt and sage arranged in a protective circle around the Ouija board. Jake held the ancient book tightly, his fingers trembling as he began to recite the closing ritual's words, a mix of languages long forgotten. The air thickened, charged with an electric tension. Shadows writhed and twisted against the walls, voices rising in a haunting chorus that clawed at their minds. Suddenly, the faceless figures appeared, their silent eyes boring into Jake's soul. The house groaned under their weight. But Jake pressed on, voice growing stronger with each phrase. The shadows screamed, a sound both terrible and beautiful. Then, with a blinding flash, the room fell silent. The oppressive weight lifted. The faceless watchers vanished. The house was still. The friends looked at each other, exhausted but alive. Jake exhaled deeply. For now, it was over. The days after the ritual were eerily quiet. The house felt lighter, less oppressive, but Jake knew better than to believe it was truly over. He spent hours inspecting every corner, every crack in the walls, searching for any sign that the spirits might still linger. One evening, as he sat alone in the living room, the silence was broken by a faint tapping on the window. Jake turned slowly. There, just outside, was a single pale handprint, dripping wet as if freshly pressed against the glass. His heart pounded. A voice, barely a whisper, floated on the breeze. "We'll be back." Jake closed his eyes, a shiver running down his spine. He knew the house, and its ghosts, would never truly leave. Jake sat by the window, staring out into the night. The house was silent, but his mind wasn't. The echoes of the past weeks haunted him more than any ghost ever could. He reached for the Ouija board's box, sealed tightly, and hesitated. The temptation to open it was overwhelming, but he knew better now. The shadows still flickered at the edge of his vision, reminding him that some doors should never be opened twice. As the clock struck midnight, Jake whispered a vow to himself. "I will never let them in again." Outside, the wind howled softly, carrying distant whispers that faded into the dark. But Jake was ready. He would keep watch. Forever. For weeks, Jake tried to rebuild his life. The house felt quieter now, almost peaceful. But the peace was fragile, like the calm before a storm. He avoided the basement, locked the closet where the Ouija board remained, and didn't speak of the faceless watchers to anyone. One night, as he lay in bed, he heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming on wood. It came from the closet. Jake held his breath. The tapping grew louder, then stopped suddenly. He told himself it was just the house settling. But deep down, he knew it was a warning. Something was still waiting. The tapping from the closet haunted Jake's nights. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw shadowy figures lurking just beyond the edge of his vision. He grew exhausted, barely able to distinguish dreams from waking reality. One evening, as rain hammered against the windows, Jake finally summoned the courage to open the closet door. Inside, the Ouija board box sat undisturbed, but the air was thick, heavy with a suffocating presence. He stepped back as a cold gust swept out, extinguishing the lone candle he'd lit. Suddenly, the whispering voices returned, louder and more insistent than ever. "You can't hide." Jake's heart pounded. The ghosts were not finished with him. The whispering grew relentless. Every night, the voices seemed closer, surrounding Jake like a storm he could neither see nor escape. One evening, his phone buzzed with a message. No number. No name. Just a simple invitation. Come back. His fingers trembled as he read it. Jake stared at the Ouija board box in the closet, then at the darkened window. He knew what they wanted. And he knew he was running out of time. Jake stood at the edge of the driveway, the night air cold against his skin. The house loomed ahead, dark and silent except for the faint creaks of settling wood. The Ouija board box was heavy in his backpack, a weight he carried with dread. Ricky and John waited behind him, their faces pale but resolute. "We don't have a choice," Jake said. "If we don't finish this, it never ends." Together, they stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of dust and something older, something waiting. The shadows stirred. Whispers circled their heads like vultures. Jake swallowed hard, the planchette warm in his pocket, almost pulsing. "We have to close the door. Once and for all." The three friends gathered in the dimly lit living room. Candles flickered, casting dancing shadows across the walls. The Ouija board was set carefully on the table, the planchette resting in the center. Jake opened the ancient book and began to chant the incantation. The air grew heavy, the temperature dropped sharply. The shadows twisted and writhed, voices rising in an angry chorus. The faceless figures appeared one last time, their silent eyes burning into Jake's soul. With a final, desperate shout, Jake finished the ritual. A blinding light filled the room, and the oppressive presence shattered like glass. The house fell silent. For the first time in months, Jake felt free. Morning light poured through the windows, warm and golden, washing away the shadows that had haunted Jake for so long. The house felt lighter, almost welcoming. Jake, Ricky, and John sat together, exhausted but relieved. The weight that had pressed down on them for weeks was finally lifted. Jake looked at the Ouija board, now just a simple wooden board again, no glowing eyes, no whispered threats. For a moment, peace seemed possible. But as Jake reached to close the box, a chill ran down his spine. A faint whisper brushed his ear. "Until next time." He froze. Then, slowly, the box snapped shut. Weeks later, Jake tried to move on. The nightmares had ceased, the whispers faded into distant memory. He even smiled again, shared laughs with Ricky and John. But sometimes, when the house was quiet, he'd catch a glimpse, a flicker of shadow in the corner of his eye. A faint chill in the air. One night, as Jake lay in bed, the phone buzzed. An unknown number. A message appeared. "We're still here." Jake's heart pounded. He pulled the covers over his head, but he knew the truth. Some doors, once opened, never close. Jake sat alone in the darkened living room, the quiet heavy around him. Though the worst had passed, the feeling of being watched never fully left. The ghosts of the house had become a part of him, their presence a shadow at the edge of every thought. He glanced at the Ouija board box resting on the shelf, sealed tight but never far away. A faint whisper brushed past his ear, barely audible. "We will wait." Jake exhaled slowly, a mix of fear and acceptance settling over him. He knew the spirits were patient. And so was he. His vigil had only just begun. Months turned into years. Jake moved away, changed jobs, tried to forget. But the house, and its ghosts, never left his mind. One quiet evening, he found himself drawn back to the box containing the Ouija board. As he opened it, a cold wind swept through the room, and a familiar voice whispered softly, "You can never truly leave." Jake closed the box quickly, heart racing. Some shadows linger, not in the house, but in the soul. And some stories never end. Jake had moved across the country, hoping distance would sever the ties to the haunting. But as he unpacked boxes in his new apartment, a familiar chill crept through the air. That night, as he lay in bed, the shadows gathered in the corners of the room, faint and flickering. A whisper floated across the silence. "Home is where we find you." Jake pulled the blanket over his head, heart pounding. No matter where he went, the ghosts followed. The nights in Jake's new apartment grew darker and colder. Shadows lengthened, flickering unnaturally against the walls. He tried to ignore the whispers, at first faint, then growing louder, more insistent. One night, his phone lit up with a text from an unknown number. "We see you." Jake's blood ran cold. He looked around the empty room, heart pounding. The faceless watchers were back. And they would never stop watching. Jake stood before the window, staring out into the endless night. The faceless watchers lingered in every shadow, every reflection. His heart ached with a weariness deeper than sleep could cure. A soft voice whispered behind him. "You belong to us." He didn't turn. Instead, he whispered back, "Then I'll wait." The house, the ghosts, the whispers, they were part of him now. And so was his endless vigil. Jake felt the cold seep into his bones as the faceless watchers closed in around him, their silent gazes weighing heavy. He no longer fought, the resistance had worn thin. The whispers turned into a lullaby, soft and soothing. "You are ours. Forever." He closed his eyes, surrendering to the darkness that embraced him. And in that moment, Jake became one with the shadows. Years later, the house stood silent once more, empty to the outside world but alive with secrets. A new occupant moved in, unaware of the legacy waiting in the walls. The Ouija board sat hidden, waiting for its next visitors. Somewhere deep within the shadows, Jake's presence lingered, no longer a victim, but a guardian. A whisper escaped the darkness. "Welcome home." The new occupant settled in, unaware of the history etched into the very foundation. The Ouija board, dust-covered and silent, waited patiently in the closet. One night, laughter and voices echoed through the empty halls. Friends gathered around the board, curiosity gleaming in their eyes. The planchette began to move. A chill filled the air. The shadows stirred. The cycle was beginning again. The new group of friends gathered in the living room, excitement mixing with a hint of nervousness. The Ouija board lay on the table, its surface scratched and worn, the planchette waiting patiently. "Ready?" one of them asked. They placed their fingers lightly on the planchette. The room grew colder, the shadows deepening at the edges. Slowly, the planchette moved. Letters spelled out. "Welcome." A chill ran through the room as an unseen presence filled the air. The house had awakened once more. The group exchanged uneasy glances as the planchette spelled out its chilling message. The air thickened with tension, the candles flickering as though struggling against an unseen wind. "I don't like this," one whispered, voice trembling. But the others pressed on, curiosity overpowering fear. Suddenly, the room's temperature plummeted, their breath visible in the icy air. The shadows around them stretched and writhed, forming shapes, indistinct faces, faceless watchers. The house was alive again, hungry for souls. And the new chapter had begun. The friends' fingers trembled on the planchette as it glided across the board, spelling words that sent chills down their spines. "Who seeks us?" A silence fell. No one dared speak. Suddenly, the lights flickered and dimmed. The shadows deepened. A soft, breathy voice echoed from the walls. "Welcome to your nightmare." Panic rose as the room grew colder, the unseen eyes watching. They had awakened the house's darkest secrets. Panic erupted as the room plunged into darkness. The friends scrambled to find their phones, the weak glow of their screens casting eerie shadows on the walls. Suddenly, a cold presence gripped Jake's arm, like icy fingers wrapping around his skin. He tried to pull away, but the pressure tightened. A whisper hissed in his ear, chilling and cruel. "You belong to us now." His friends shouted his name, but the darkness swallowed their voices. Jake's heart thundered as he felt the unseen grip pull him closer to the shadows. Jake's breath hitched as the icy grip dragged him toward the inky darkness pooling in the corner of the room. His friends reached out, but their hands passed through him like smoke. "Jake!" Ricky shouted, desperation in his voice. "Hold on. Fight it." But Jake felt himself slipping, as if falling into a bottomless pit of shadows. The whispers grew louder, echoing inside his mind. "You are ours." His body went limp, and a cold numbness spread through his limbs. When he opened his eyes, the room was empty. His friends were gone. And the house was waiting. Jake found himself in a place that was neither here nor there, a shadowy void filled with distant echoes and flickering shapes. Time lost meaning. He could hear the faint voices of Ricky and John calling out, but their forms were blurred, unreachable. The faceless watchers surrounded him, their silent eyes fixed and unblinking. They whispered secrets of the house, of lives lost, and of the darkness that never ends. Jake struggled to remember who he was. Was he still himself, or just another shadow trapped forever? A cold hand brushed against his cheek. "You belong." In the endless darkness, a faint light flickered. Jake's mind clung to it like a lifeline. The voices around him grew louder, but through the noise, a single word stood out. "Fight." Summoning every ounce of strength, Jake pushed against the shadows, pulling him deeper into the void. His own voice, trembling but resolute, whispered back, "I am not yours." The faceless watchers recoiled, their forms distorting and writhing as Jake fought for control. A crack appeared in the darkness, a thin beam of light breaking through. Could he escape? Or was this just another illusion? Jake focused on the light, willing his body to move toward it. The shadows clawed at him, their whispers rising to a deafening roar. "You cannot leave," they hissed. But Jake's determination burned brighter. He reached out, grasping the light as if it were his last hope. Suddenly, the darkness shattered like glass, and Jake gasped as he was pulled back into his bedroom. His friends were there, faces pale but alive. The oppressive weight lifted, and silence returned. But Jake knew the battle wasn't over. In the days that followed Jake's return from the void, a fragile calm settled over the house.